The 8,333rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in Myanmar. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Bangladesh and Myanmar to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Tegegnework Gettu, Associate Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and Ms. Cate Blanchett, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Goodwill Ambassador. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary-General, His Excellency, Mr. António Guterres, and give him the floor. Secretary-General.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, I join you today with a heavy heart. The massive refugee emergency that began 1 year ago in Rakhine State, Myanmar, has become one of the world's worst humanitarian and human rights crises. Last month, I visited Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh and heard stories of horrendous persecution and suffering. One father broke down as he told me how his son was shot dead in front of him, his mother was brutally murdered, and his house burned to the ground. He took refuge in a mosque only to be discovered by soldiers who abused him and burned the Quran. I know members of the Council heard similar harrowing accounts on your own visit to the region. You highlighted in your press statement of 9 May the degree to which, and I quote, you were struck by the scale of the humanitarian crisis and how you, and I quote again, remain gravely concerned by the current situation. You also reaffirmed the Security Council Presidential Statement of 6 November 2017, which, and I quote, strongly condemns the widespread violence that has taken place in Rakhine State. And you expressed your, and I quote again, grave concern over reports of human rights violations and abuses in Rakhine State, including by the Myanmar security forces, in particular against persons belonging to the Rohingya community, end of quote. 1 year ago, I condemned immediately the attacks by extremists against the security forces. But these attacks could never justify disproportionate use of force against civilian populations and the gross human rights violations committed by the Myanmar security forces and their allies. Last September, I sent an official letter to this Council urging concerted efforts to prevent further escalation of the crisis in northern Rakhine State. Following my direct engagement with the Myanmar authorities and several initiatives on the ground by the UN system, I expressed my concerns regarding the dramatic humanitarian and human rights situations. And I emphasized the risks to regional peace and security of further degeneration. As you know, I've also been working to advance a policy of engagement and unified action to encourage positive actions by the government, help diffuse tensions between communities, and build confidence and trust. In April, I appointed Christine Schraner-Burgener as my special envoy on Myanmar, and she's undertaking a process of broad consultations, including with the government and the military and with civil society and women's groups. I appreciate this Council's strong support and welcome Myanmar's positive cooperation with her so far. In June, UNHCR, UNDP, and the Myanmar authorities finalized the Memorandum of Understanding that establishes a framework for cooperation to create conditions for the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable repatriation of refugees from Bangladesh. The MOU is also aimed at helping to create improved and resilient livelihoods for all communities living in Rakhine State. But of course, all of this requires a massive investment, not only in reconstruction and development for all communities in one of Myanmar's poorest regions, but also in reconciliation and respect for human rights. I do not yet see the needed commitment for that investment to take place. It is clear that conditions are not yet met for the safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of Rohingya refugees to their places of origin or choice. And I ask members of the Security Council to join me in urging the Myanmar authorities to cooperate with the United Nations and to ensure immediate, unimpeded, and effective access for its agencies and partners. And we must also continue to press for the release of journalists who have been arrested for reporting on this human tragedy. Access is critical to meet the enormous needs and to allay the fears of refugees who would like to return home. For people who remain in Rakhine, it would allow for consultations on quick impact projects based on their assessed needs. Those Rohingya who remain in Rakhine continue to face marginalization and discrimination. Many have been cut off from life-saving humanitarian assistance, and some 130,000 Rohingya remain confined in camps with severe restrictions on their freedom of movement. They have extremely limited access to health, education, and other essential services, and to ways of making a living. There can be no excuse for delaying the search for dignified solutions that will allow people to return to their areas of origin in safety and dignity, in line with international standards and human rights. And the United Nations remains ready to help develop such a plan. Voluntary relocation, along with freedom of movement, an end to segregation and discrimination, inclusive development, the re-establishment of the rule of law and public safety are essential. And it is ultimately the responsibility of Myanmar's leaders to demonstrate greater resolve in upholding the principles of equality and non-discrimination, countering incitement to racial hatred and violence. Mr. President, I want to once again applaud the tremendous generosity of the Bangladeshi authorities and host communities. But the response to the crisis must be a global one. The international humanitarian appeal for the Rohingya crisis remains significantly underfunded at 33%. Much more must be done to alleviate the very real risks to life from current and impending monsoons. I'm grateful to the World Bank, President Jim Yong Kim, for mobilizing almost $500 million in grant-based support for Rohingya refugees and host communities. The grant-based assistance approved by the Asian Development Bank is also crucial in meeting medium-term needs and providing assistance towards life-saving priorities. Yet refugees need more access to education and livelihoods to avoid further vulnerability to the risks of trafficking, sexual exploitation, and radicalization. Mr. President, I cannot forget the stories I heard in Cox's Bazar. When this distraught woman gestured to a mother cradling a young baby who was conceived as a result of rape and told me, and I quote, "We need security in Myanmar and citizenship, and we want justice for what our sisters, our daughters, our mothers have suffered." End of quote. Accountability is essential for genuine reconciliation between all ethnic groups and is a prerequisite for regional security and stability. Regrettably, Myanmar has refused to cooperate with the United Nations human rights entities and mechanisms, despite repeated calls to do so, including by members of this Council. We have called for different accountability options to be considered. And most recently, very strong concerns have been expressed by the UN Independent Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar, appointed by the Human Rights Council. Its report, issued yesterday, found, and I quote, "patterns of gross human rights violations and abuses committed by the security forces, which is said, and I quote again, undoubtedly amount to the gravest crimes under international law." End of quote. I believe this report's findings and recommendations deserve serious consideration by all relevant United Nations bodies. Effective international cooperation will be critical to ensure that accountability mechanisms are credible, transparent, impartial, independent, and comply with Myanmar's obligations under international law. Excellencies, this Council has issued a strong presidential statement. We also have the clear recommendations of the Kofi Annan-led Advisory Commission on Rakhine State as a guiding framework, a framework that takes into account the needs of the victims and address root causes, including discrimination, persecution, and lack of legal status. I would like to take this opportunity to commend once again the statesmanship of the late former Secretary-General in Myanmar and elsewhere. But there is much still to be done to provide the necessary conditions for peace and justice in Rakhine. So long as a climate of fear and persecution prevails in Rakhine, voluntary returns will not take place. All communities in Rakhine are poor and need sustainable and inclusive development, and this is also essential for reconciliation and peace. I would add that patterns of violations against ethnic and religious minorities beyond Rakhine must also end for genuine democracy to take root. Mr. President, a year has passed and this crisis cannot continue indefinitely. This Council has shown unity in adopting its presidential statement. That unity remains essential if we are to answer clear appeals with action. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary-General for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Tegegnework Gettu.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary-General, distinguished delegates, thank you for the opportunity to address the Council. UNDP continues to share the international community's concern about the situation in Rakhine State and the plight of the Rakhine people. We fully align ourselves with the need to create conditions for the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of refugees from Bangladesh, as foreseen in the Memorandum of Understanding signed between the Government of Myanmar, UNHCR, and UNDP. Myanmar faces multiple transitions today regarding the ongoing peace process, economic liberalization, and democratic reforms, and it's within the context that the root cause of inequality and discrimination against Rohingya population need to be addressed. Competition for land and resources in the Rakhine, which is the second poorest state in the country, discriminatory laws and institutions, as well as intercommunal mistrust and tensions contribute to some of these causes. Creating sustainable conditions of voluntary return requires comprehensive and durable solutions. Addressing the significant development challenges of all communities in Rohingya and removing local orders that restrict the freedom of movement and access to basic services and critical in creating such conditions are important. It also requires that every refugee have the freedom to decide when to return based on a free and informed choice. Dealing with these issues also may go a long way towards building greater intercommunal confidence and trust among the people of Rakhine states. As noted by the Secretary-General, the recommendation of the Rakhine Advisory Commission provides a roadmap for addressing these issues. Recently, the government of Myanmar converted the United Nations system to take stock on the implementation of those recommendations, which is a positive step. Mr. President, as a first step towards creating conducive conditions for voluntary return of the Rakhine state, UNDP and UNHCR have been working closely to begin implementation of the tripartite Memorandum of Understanding. We have reinforced our capacity on the ground to bring this important work. We have also jointly held a range of preparatory consultations with the government of Myanmar and all levels, including the technical working group formed by the government to support the implementation of the MOU. In early July, we jointly undertook a first, albeit symbolic, visit to the northern part of Rahani, which was followed by a joint familiarization field visit with the technical working group later that month. We welcome these preliminary measures taken by Myanmar and look forward to moving ahead constructively and meaningfully. However, effective access and streamlined procedures are essential for us to access entire village tracts and undertake area-based programming that are inclusive, in line with the conflict-sensitive methods, and that build social cohesion. This remains outstanding. Free and independent consultations with all communities to identify their needs is a necessary step to design and deliver community-based, quick impact projects that address livelihoods and basic needs to build trust within and between communities. It also lays the foundation for planning longer-term sustainable development as foreseen in the MOU. This, together with the freedom of movement and pathway to citizenship, will be critical benchmark that must be achieved. In addition to the MOU implementation, UNDP and UNHCR and several other UN agencies have been working in order to pass Rahani states to implement a wide range of development and humanitarian assistance initiatives with major donor support. Part of the broader solution in Rahani lies in tackling some of the very challenging issues in addition to freedom of movement, such as access to livelihood, education and health services, respect for the rule of law, and respect, promotion and protecting human rights. UNDP is currently helping to address some of these challenges through support of resilience-based recovery and sustainable development. Mr. President, we would like to acknowledge the government of Bangladesh for their generous hospitality and support to the Rohingya refugees. As anticipated, the monsoon, coupled with the limited resource made available to the UN and its partners meet the need of refugees' host communities, have made the living conditions of refugees in Cox's Bazar very precarious. Creating conditions conducive to voluntary, safe, dignified, sustainable return to Myanmar is a process that requires at least medium-term planning. Continuing to address these needs of all those affected in Cox's Bazar is a primary important thing to do. In closing, we wish to underline the importance of pursuing a comprehensive and durable solution with effective access, freedom of movement, and pathway to citizenship being critically built blocks from the sustainable development of Rakhine State. We reiterate our strong commitment and continue constructive engagement with the government of Myanmar and Bangladesh in creating an environment where people of all communities can live together. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Gettu for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Cate Blanchett.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished delegates, Mr. Secretary-General, ladies and gentlemen, I am honoured by the opportunity to address the Security Council at this critical juncture. I am not here as an expert. I stand before you merely as a witness, as someone who has seen and cannot look away. I went to Bangladesh last March as a UNHCR Goodwill ambassador to see what I could possibly contribute in responding to the massive humanitarian needs unfolding there. Nothing could have prepared me for the extent and depth of the suffering I saw. An 18-year-old woman, who I'll call Layla, is chief amongst my memories. One of the 720,000 stateless Rohingya refugees who fled violence and abuse in Myanmar's Rakhine state since last August, Layla fled her burning village with her infant son, Yusuf. As she cradled Yusuf in her arms, she described to me how her husband was forcibly taken from her village and how he had not been heard from since. How, 5 days later, these same people returned, setting fire to her home and forcing her to flee alone with her baby. She saw her uncle killed by men with knives. She told me, "When I saw this, I just ran." She and her son hid in a forest for months, surviving off plants and trees. Her harrowing journey ended in Bangladesh, where her present hardship persists. another refugee family took her and Youssef in, sharing their cramped shelter. And as I sat with Layla, a small child was playing behind me, and I noticed some terrible scars on his leg. And when I asked how he came by these, his family told me that he had been caught in the flames when their home had been torched. Luckily, they pulled him free, but the scars will remain, both the physical and the psychological. If only such stories were atypical. But visiting with refugee families in Bangladesh, I found that they were shockingly routine. Like you, I have heard the gut-wrenching accounts, stories of grave torture, of women brutally violated, people who have had their loved ones killed before their eyes, children who have seen their grandparents locked in houses that were set alight. I am a mother, and I saw my own children in the eyes of every single refugee child that I met. I saw myself in every parent. How can any mother endure seeing her child thrown into a fire? Their experiences will never leave me. And this is why I'm immensely grateful that the Security Council, the principal body responsible for maintaining international peace and security, is working in unison to resolve this crisis. And I am particularly thankful to you, Mr. Secretary-General, for giving voice to the Rohingya over the last decade and for continuing to demonstrate exemplary leadership on this matter. And I must also pay homage to the former Secretary-General, the late Dr. Kofi Annan, who has given us a clear and practical vision to resolve the crisis in Rakhine State, a vision that is shared by this Council and one which the government of Myanmar has committed to implementing. A vision that, if realised, will ensure that women, men and children of different religions, ethnicities and backgrounds in the Rakhine State can thrive collectively. But as this Council and the UN work with the government of Myanmar to ensure this, urgent efforts are still needed for the Rohingya in Bangladesh. Mr. President, it is important to recall that this is not the first wave of massive forced displacement of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar to Bangladesh in the last 40 years. The scale of displacement is so large and so severe that today there are more Rohingya living in exile than in Myanmar itself. In 1978, 200,000 Rohingya refugees streamed into Bangladesh, freeing brutality and widespread abuse. Gul Zahar, a young Rohingya woman, was amongst those who fled. 14 years later, in 1992, another wave of violence forced 250,000 stateless Rohingya refugees to seek safety once again in neighbouring Bangladesh. Once again, Gul Zahar was amongst those who fled. Today, there are 900,000 stateless Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. Gul Zahar, now 90 years of age, is sadly amongst them once more. 4 decades following her initial flight, Gul lives in abject poverty in Bangladesh, with the sole wish that her great-grandchildren will have a better future. The need for this future to transpire inside Myanmar has never been more urgent. If we fail to act now, Gul's grandchildren, like thousands of others, will be unable to escape this relentless cycle that generations of Rohingya have experienced. Mr. President, Bangladesh's recent response, receiving over 700,000 refugees in a matter of months and providing them safety, is one of the most visible and significant gestures of humanity in our time. But the needs are vast. The suffering is acute. Much more international support is needed. Thanks to the efforts of the Bangladeshi government, the host communities, UN agencies, NGOs, and the refugees themselves, life-saving efforts have ensured that the Rohingya refugees have endured the monsoons largely unscathed. Yet, as you yourselves have seen, they continue to live in squalid conditions. With only 33% of the refugee operation funded, amounting to less than 70 cents per person per day, this is not surprising. Rather, it is quite embarrassing. Many Bangladeshi villages living nearby with very little to call their own have been helping the Rohingya refugees over the past year. If people with so little can step up, why can't we do better? Refugees need to feed their families. They need clean water and sanitation facilities to wash, to cook, to clean. They need a secure shelter to weather monsoons and the heat. Their children need an education. Their grandparents need to be cared for. But they need more than just food and water, informal schools, temporary shelter. They need a future. In the refugee settlements in Bangladesh today, women who were raped in Myanmar are now giving birth to children. These children, already burdened by statelessness, are likely to carry this stigma for the rest of their lives. So many women, like Layla, among their children, continue to be vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Many are still battling the scars of trauma and injury they received before and during their flight to Bangladesh. It is imperative that governments, development and humanitarian agencies, the private sector and individuals work in solidarity to find innovative ways to help the refugees and the Bangladeshi host communities. Mr. President, the focus of our efforts must be to provide the much-needed support inside Bangladesh whilst working to ensure conditions in Myanmar are conducive to returns. The many refugees that I spoke with consider Myanmar their home, but they have real, deep fears about returning there. The denial of their right to move, their right to marry, their right to work, their right to healthcare and education renders them amongst the most vulnerable people on the planet. Refugees move back home when it is safe and secure to do so. The Rohingya cannot return to the very conditions they were forced to flee. They cannot settle for half solutions. They must know that they belong. A clear pathway to full citizenship is essential. This is not a luxury. This is not a privilege. This is a basic right that all of us here enjoy, a right that the Rohingya do not have. I implore this Council not to forget this imperative and to support all efforts to make it a reality, and in the meantime, to encourage more robust international support required to meet urgent and pressing needs within Bangladesh. My mind often returns to Layla and her neighbours. Did she find out what happened to her husband? Did her shared temporary shelter survive the monsoons? Did she manage to celebrate Eid last week? Will her young son, Yusuf, be able to return home to Myanmar and go to school one day? Or, like Gul Zahar, will he too suffer an endless cycle of fear and forced displacement? Mr. President, together we need to change the future of Layla, of Yusuf, of Gul Zahar, and of the Rohingya living in Myanmar, in Bangladesh and beyond. There are no shortcuts. There are no alternatives. We have failed the Rohingya before. Please, let us not fail them again. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Blanchett for her very poignant and moving briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Minister of State for the Commonwealth and the United Nations of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Mr. Secretary-General, Mr. Under-Secretary-General, Ms. Blanchett, the plight of the Rohingya community is one of the largest refugee crises in recent history, and it is one of the most pressing humanitarian and human rights crises facing this Council, our Council today. A year on, the Rohingya population of Rakhine State, who were subjected to a campaign of the most truly horrific violence, resulting in grave violations of their human rights and indeed expulsion and deportation from their homes. It is this Council which has a duty to ensure they receive justice and the prospect of a peaceful future. The report issued yesterday by the UN fact-finding mission is the most authoritative account yet of the crimes committed against the Rohingya community. The report details widespread rape and murder committed by the Burmese military, the systematic oppression and persecution they have suffered for so many years, and the patterns of violence and violations committed elsewhere in the country. This Council is charged by the international community with the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Crimes against humanity, such as those detailed in the fact-finding mission's report, threaten international peace. They threaten international security. Forced deportations across borders, such as the Rohingya suffered into Bangladesh, are unfriendly acts, but also they threaten international peace and security. So it is incumbent the Council should consider the report in depth once the fact-finding mission have made their final presentation to the Human Rights Council in September. But let us be clear, those most affected by this crisis now reside in Bangladesh. As we've already heard, over 700,000 Rohingya refugees, joining more than 300,000 displaced people in previous rounds of violence. Bangladesh, together with the UN and other humanitarian organizations, has indeed saved many thousands of lives. Bangladesh has also, working with the UN and international NGOs, have taken significant steps in recent months to mitigate the worst effects of the monsoon season. And as we've already heard, indeed so movingly, from Ms. Blanchett, the Rohingya need our continued support. Their needs range from food, shelter, clean water to education, livelihoods, and specialized assistance. And we must not forget this. They need specialized support and assistance for those victims of sexual violence. The UN's Joint Response Plan remains desperately underfunded, and it is imperative that we all step up and play our part. But the solution to this crisis, let us be clear, lies in Burma. The Rohingya community deserve justice. The fact-finding mission has concluded that what happened in Rakhine last year warrants, and I quote, the investigation and prosecution of senior officials in the Tatmadaw chain of command so that a competent court can determine their liability for genocide in relation to the situation in Rakhine State, end quote. With so much at stake, it is this Council that has a duty to ensure that there is no impunity for such acts. As our Prime Minister Theresa May's Special Representative on preventing sexual violence in conflict, let me assure the Council, let me assure the Rohingya community, this is a key priority for our government, for our Prime Minister, and for myself. And the Rohingya must be able to return home to Rakhine safely, voluntarily, and, importantly, with dignity. That means more than returning to IDP camps on the Burmese side of the border, but real progress towards a more just long-term solution and state of affairs in Rakhine. As a result of this Council's concerted action, though, we have seen some steps forward. The Burmese government has engaged with Special Envoy Christine Schraner Bergner, whose diplomatic work we support. They have signed an MOU with UNHCR and UNDP. They have established a commission of inquiry to look into reports of human rights violations. These steps are welcome. They have not been easy for the civilian government, whose action remains constrained by the military. But more needs to be done. The steps taken are not enough. The Burmese authorities need to provide UNHCR and the UNDP unconditional and unqualified access to northern Rakhine. Until these UN agencies can operate effectively, it is impossible to argue that conditions in Rakhine are anywhere near what is required for the safe, voluntary and dignified repatriation that this Council has called for. There is an urgent need for domestic acceptance and accountability in Burma. It is essential that the Burmese government sets out how its commission of inquiry will be able to investigate these crimes with full impartiality, how it will access United Nations information, and how it will be linked to a judicial process to hold accountable those responsible, and let us be clear, particularly those in the military. It is far from clear that any mechanism established by the Burmese authorities can do this, which is why the UK supports keeping open the option of justice delivered through international mechanisms. We need to see practical progress on implementing the Rakhine Advisory Commission's recommendations. That includes recommendations on economic development, which are part of the solution, but it also includes those related to the rights of the Rohingya, including a pathway to citizenship. These recommendations, taken comprehensively, as they were set out by the revered and respected late Kofi Annan, remain the best blueprint for a long-term solution in Rakhine. So what does it mean for us? What does it mean for the Security Council? It means, in our view, that the Council should do three things. Firstly, continue to assist Bangladesh and the United Nations in providing protection and assistance to the Rohingya population and their host communities. Second, take concerted action to push for justice and the prospect of a peaceful future that the Rohingya community deserve. This includes holding a serious discussion on the conclusions of the fact-finding mission's report. And thirdly, support those in Burma who are pushing for progress. But we should also be prepared to use the full range of tools at this Council's disposal to apply pressure against those, including the Burmese military, who obstruct it. The United Kingdom has done this within the European Union, where we have sanctioned 7 senior Burmese military officials. But we all accept this crisis is complex and has deep roots. It will not be solved overnight. But let us also be clear, it will not be solved without continued engagement and action from this Council. So as we mark 1 year on from the violence of August 2017, this Council should shoulder its responsibility and do justice to the gravity of the attacks on the Rohingya community. We should not be just discussing and debating. We need to be acting to bring an end to the appalling ethnic cleansing, to help those suffering refugees, and bring justice for the victims of these appalling crimes. And I appeal to all fellow members. Let us put aside our differences. Let us act on the principles of our Charter and our obligations in front of us. Let us act in the interests of Layla, in the interests of Yusuf, and tens of thousands of Laylas and Yusufs. Let us act for the sake of humanity. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, at the outset, may I thank you for having taken the initiative to organise this meeting almost a year to the day after the beginning of the crisis in Rakhine State. I'd also like to hail the personal commitment of the Secretary-General in drawing attention to the issue and attracting international action to this issue. I'd also like to warmly thank the Goodwill Ambassador from the UNHCR, Ms. Cate Blanchett, as well as the Assistant Secretary-General, Mr. Tegegnework Gettu, for their briefings on this situation, which really does require the sustained and determined attention of this Council. Before the UN General Assembly almost a year ago, the President of France denounced the ethnic cleansing of which the Rohingya had been victims. France, since then, has continued to underscore its concern at the grave violations of human rights and international humanitarian law committed in organised, coordinated and systematic fashion in Rakhine State. Today, I would like to make 3 observations. Firstly, my first observation. Commitments have been made by the Myanmarese authorities and should now be implemented. These are first steps to be encouraged, but progress on the ground remains very limited and is not adequate to the scale or the gravity of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law that have been committed. In this regard, France is very concerned by the preliminary conclusions of the report of the Human Rights Council fact-finding mission. According to it, genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, which fall within the purview of the International Criminal Court, could be brought, or charges could be brought against the Myanmarese army. France has called on the international community to carry out determined action to collect and protect evidence and to ensure that those responsible for the crimes against the Rohingya population are brought to justice. France furthermore reiterates its call on the Myanmarese authorities to cooperate with the Special Rapporteur, as well as with the United Nations fact-finding mission. We've taken note of Myanmar's establishment of a commission of inquiry on human rights violations. Nonetheless, at this stage, we have no information guaranteeing the independence or the impartiality of this mechanism, nor on protection provided to witnesses. Furthermore, we condemn the serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law committed against children, and we hope that Ms. Virginia Gamba, the Secretary-General's Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, who recently visited the country, will soon be able to report to the Council on her mission and to provide it with an update. Furthermore, we hail the conclusion of a Memorandum of Understanding with the UNDP and the High Commissioner of Refugees. This is an essential step to allow us, when the time comes, to ensure a voluntary, safe, dignified and sustainable return of Rohingya refugees. Nonetheless, we remain concerned about ongoing restrictions of access. Only unimpeded access to all of the villages affected and all communities will allow us to ensure that the conditions for such a return have been met. On the recommendations of the Annan Commission, finally, figures are regularly put forward by the Myanmarese authorities, but we have very little specific information on the way in which measures are really being put in place. France in particular reiterates the importance of recommendations on the issue of citizenship and the revision of the law of 1982, as well as on equal rights for all members of the Rohingya community. We also support the recommendations on free movement of populations, access to the media, and also socio-economic development in Rakhine State. President, secondly, I would like to briefly touch on the humanitarian dimension of the crisis. France, both in its national capacity and within the European Union, has provided support to Bangladesh, which continues to host on its territory, with admirable generosity, almost 1 million Rohingya refugees who live in particularly precarious conditions. The UNHCR and the other agencies within the United Nations have accomplished remarkable work. The international community should continue to support Bangladesh and the humanitarian agencies on 3 priorities. Firstly, increasing the contributions to humanitarian response, which remains underfunded at only 33%. Secondly, continuing to take the measures necessary for protection of the Rohingya people in the face of health and security risks in camps. And thirdly, continuing to support Bangladesh, humanitarian stakeholders and local host populations to make the living conditions of Rohingya refugees as bearable as possible, all the while preserving the possibilities of Bangladesh's own economic development. Particular attention must be paid to the needs of children, in particular in terms of schooling, and to those of women who have suffered unspeakable violence. This is essential. I still have in my mind the image and the statements of the women who we met in Cox's Bazar last spring. And finally, and this will be my third and my last point, the Security Council and the international community should remain fully committed to ensure adequate follow-up of the full implementation of the presidential election of last November and of the tripartite agreement concluded between the government of Myanmar, the UNHCR and the UNDP on return of refugees. Mr. President, the response to the tragedy of the Rohingya comes through dealing with the deep-rooted causes of the crisis. It also requires that justice be done. This Council has had the opportunity a few weeks ago to engage in deep dialogue with the Special Envoy of the Secretary-General, Ms. Christina Schreiner-Bergener, and to reiterate to her our full support for her in her duties. We encourage the Myanmar authorities to continue to cooperate closely with the Special Envoy to reach a sustainable solution. The high-level week of the General Assembly next month will also give an opportunity to continue this mobilization. If there is no tangible progress on the ground in the weeks to come, we should look with attention at the new actions that the Security Council might take to respond to the crisis of Rohingya refugees. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Halabja, 1988. Srebrenica, 1995. Darfur, 2003. The list of examples in modern history where white violence has triumphed is long, too long. Regrettably, it seems a new name will now be added to this tragic list: Rakhine 2017. The reports of systematic and widespread human rights violations and abuses against the Rohingya community in Rakhine State, as well as other gross violations of international law committed in Kachin and Shan states, cannot be neglected. We have seen clear indications of crimes against humanity, horrifying testimonies of torture and inhumane treatment, rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, summary and arbitrary killings can have left no one untouched. Mr. President, let me thank you for having called this meeting, marking 1 year since the violence in Rakhine began to escalate. Let me also thank the Secretary-General for his strong statement, as well as for his personal commitment and engagement. We also recognize Ms. Cate Blanchett's important contribution to mobilize needed support and attention. Sweden has actively contributed to the Council's engagement on Myanmar since the first day of our membership. Some steps to address the situation have been taken. In November last year, a united Council adopted a presidential statement setting out a plan for action. In March this year, the Council paid a successful visit to the region to gain first-hand understanding and convey clear messages. And in April, a UN Special Envoy was appointed with strong political support for her mandate. But clearly, this was not enough. We need to ask ourselves what more we could have done to prevent these atrocities from taking place in the first place. Honest lessons must be drawn for future efforts to ensure that it never happens again. Mr. President, yesterday, the fact-finding mission, a UN-mandated body with distinguished membership, presented credible and solid findings on the gravity of the atrocities committed by the Myanmar security forces. This is significant and must be followed by meaningful action. The chair of the FFM should as soon as possible be given the opportunity to present the report to the Security Council. In this regard, we recall the letter circulated already during the Swedish presidency in July, proposing that the fact-finding mission present their findings and recommendations to the Council. Several initiatives by the Myanmar government to meet repeated demands for accountability have been announced, but they have regrettably all proven to fall short of expectations. With facts now having been established, the international community must shoulder its responsibility and act on accountability. Sweden has previously called for this Council to consider a referral of the situation to the ICC. In light of the fact-finding mission's report, we believe it is time to move forward, and we need to consult among members on a resolution to this end. At the same time, we should continue to work in other international bodies to ensure the establishment of an international mechanism for full and independent investigations. Mr. President, in addition to ensuring accountability, there are several other matters that this Council already has agreed upon that also needs to be urgently addressed. Firstly, response to the humanitarian needs of the refugees in Cox's Bazar must be stepped up. We commend efforts by Bangladesh. Substantially increased financial support is, however, needed also for resilience. And in this regard, we welcome the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank's recent engagement. Protection in the refugee camps, not least for the most vulnerable, must be improved. Special attention should be given to survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, both women, girls, and boys. More secure land must be provided, and general security in the camps must be improved. Secondly, the continuously dire situation in Rakhine also needs to be addressed. Full access to Rakhine for UN agencies, as well as for NGOs and media, is urgent and necessary. The MOU with UNHCR and UNDP must be implemented in full without delay. Thirdly, conditions for voluntary and safe and dignified return to areas of origin must be ensured. In this regard, the implementation of the Annan report must be stepped up to address the root causes, including the issue of citizenship. Security, reconstruction, and livelihood programs must also be urgently provided for. Mr. President, Reflecting on one of the major tragedies in recent times, the late former Secretary-General Kofi Annan noted with regret that in their greatest hour of need, the world failed the people of Rwanda. This Council cannot turn a blind eye to the atrocities committed to the Rohingya. We must now take full responsibility and do our utmost to end this nightmare. History will not look kindly upon those who fail to do so. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Sweden for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. President, we thank the UN Secretary-General and Ms. Blanchett and Ms. Gettu for their briefings on the situation in Myanmar. For our part, we consistently advocate a balanced and non-confrontational approach when discussing the situation in this country and when looking for ways to normalize the humanitarian situation in Rakhine State, including when dealing with the issues of refugees. We note the orderly work being done by the country's authorities to fulfill the Annan Commission's recommendations to find a comprehensive solution to the crisis. To date, 81 of the 88 recommendations have been fulfilled. We welcome the repeated readiness, as stated at official level in Naypyidaw, to guarantee the step-by-step return of all refugees, including displaced people, including from Bangladesh. We greatly esteem the measures carried out in Rakhine State to establish the necessary infrastructure to support and host future repatriates. We note the creation on the 30th of July of an independent commission on inquiry, which is headed and includes authoritative foreign representatives, such as Rosario Manala and Kenzo Oshima. This decision was adopted in Naypyidaw as part of a national initiative to guarantee reconciliation, peace, stability and development in Rakhine State. We are convinced that the key to solving the issue of refugees is in bilateral cooperation between Myanmar and Bangladesh. On the basis of a legal basis worked out by both parties, and coordinated mechanisms will allow them to move to practical steps in this area. We believe it would be counterproductive to take a line extending the deadlines for the process of repatriation, which is being used by some outside forces to exercise additional pressure on Myanmar. At this stage, we think the priority is establishing international assistance to overcome the most serious humanitarian elements of the crisis. We assume here that there is a need to provide help to both Bangladesh and Myanmar. Our efforts include a particular emphasis on providing assistance for both equally. In 2018-2019, Russia will earmark $1 million for both countries through the World Food Programme. We think that the role of the international community should also include providing assistance to Naypyidaw and Dhaka in carrying out the agreements they've already entered into. A positive example here is the close cooperation of the UNHCR and the UNDP with the government of Myanmar on implementing the 6th of June tripartite memorandum on cooperation, and also the activities of the special representative of the UN Secretary-General, Ms. Christina Schraner Burner, who visited the country in June and in July this year as part of a peace conference. We note also the decision of the authorities in Myanmar to agree for her office to be opened in Naypyidaw. We hope that we see the issues in Rakhine State as part of a range of challenges faced by the authorities, democratically elected authorities in Myanmar. Attempts to place responsibility for solving the crisis on Naypyidaw ignores the sorties of terrorists, which have also been the main cause of the crisis in the country and have made it more difficult to establish inter-ethnic peace within the country and to guarantee effective cooperation with the international community. We see the key to solving the problem in Rakhine State in establishing bilateral dialogue and re-establishing trust between Bangladesh and Myanmar. Therefore, we welcome any contact between both parties including the event on the 10th of August in Naypyidaw, namely a meeting at ministerial level, during which agreements were reached on the modalities for eventual process of returning refugees to Rakhine State and consolidating cooperation in the sphere of the fight of against terrorism and drug trafficking. We assumed that the crisis, as we've already said, should be solved mainly on a bilateral basis through negotiations between Myanmar and Bangladesh. The deep problems in Rakhine have a multifaceted and complex character and can be solved exclusively through peaceful diplomatic and political methods and the establishment of dialogue through the authorities in Naypyidaw and Dhaka, including the representatives of all ethnicities and religions. We hope that assistance for the powers in Myanmar and Bangladesh in solving the issues will be provided on an equal basis and in mutual respect. We hope that all parties will act responsibly and with restraint to avoid a re-escalation of the situation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, China welcomes you presiding over this open meeting and thanks Secretary-General Guterres and UNDP Associate Administrator Mr. Gettu for their briefings. China listened attentively to the statement made by UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador Ms. Blanchett. Lately, with the concerted efforts of the countries concerned, regional countries and UN agencies, there have been some positive developments in the resolution of Myanmar's Rakhine issue. In early August, Bangladesh and Myanmar held a ministerial meeting to discuss the implementation of the bilateral repatriation agreement. They reached consensus on questions such as verification forms and displaced persons at the border area and set up a hotline between ministers. At present, Myanmar is prepared to receive the people who have fled to Bangladesh. Myanmar and Bangladesh received the visiting special envoy on Myanmar, Ms. Virginia, and held in-depth exchanges with her on the Rakhine issue. Myanmar agreed to have the special envoy's regional office in Naypyidaw. The office is already in operation. The Myanmar government signed an MOU with UNHCR and UNDP. The three parties have held 2 joint working group meetings and are preparing for a joint field visit. Recently, the Myanmar government also received visits by officials from UNHCR, UNDP, IOM, and the World Bank. The government and local people of Bangladesh have continued their massive humanitarian support to the displaced people in Bangladesh, made an effort to improve their living environment and make proper arrangements to deal with the impacts of the rainy season and hurricanes. Myanmar has set up a widely representative independent commission of inquiry on the Rakhine issue and reached agreement on its terms of reference. The commission has already started its work. The Myanmar government is actively implementing the recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State. Mr. President, both Myanmar and Bangladesh are friendly neighbors of China. China has always actively engaged with both countries to find a solution to the Rakhine issue through bilateral dialogues and consultations between the two countries. In late June, State Council and Foreign Minister of China, Mr. Wang Yi, had an informal meeting with the visiting Bangladesh Foreign Minister Ali and Myanmar Minister for the Office of the State Councillor Yun Koi Ting Sui. On the basis of the 3-phase solution proposed by China last year, namely cessation of hostilities, repatriation, and development, they reached 4-point principled consensus on the proper settlement of the Rakhine issue. First, efforts should be continued along the lines of the 3-phased proposals, namely cessation of hostilities, repatriation, and development, for quick improvement of the Rakhine situation. On this basis, Myanmar and Bangladesh should find a proper solution through bilateral consultations. It serves the fundamental interests of both countries and is conducive to regional peace and stability. Second, The most pressing task is to address the repatriation of the people who fled to Bangladesh. The two countries should take effective measures as soon as possible, take substantive steps to repatriate the first batch of people. Third, China, in accordance with the will of both countries, stands ready to provide further assistance to improve living and sheltering conditions of the people fleeing conflicts, including offering emergency supplies and building relevant infrastructure. Fourth, each side should leverage their respective advantages and strengthen development cooperation in the border areas of the two countries for the well-being of the people on the ground. China is now working closely with Myanmar and Bangladesh in implementing this principled consensus. Ambassador Sun Guoxiang, Special Envoy on Asia Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, made several visits to Myanmar and Bangladesh, and through in-depth communication on the Rakhine issue, promoted mutual confidence of the two sides and encouraged the resolution of the issue through bilateral channels. Mr. Sun also briefed Security Council members and the Secretariat on his mediation efforts in New York. China supports the work of Special Envoy Ms. Bergina, who visited China in the end of June at the invitation of China and carried out candid dialogues with China on the resolution of the Rakhine issue. China has provided humanitarian material assistance to both Myanmar and Bangladesh to help improve the living conditions of the displaced people. Mr. President, the Rakhine issue has complicated historical, ethnic, and religious contexts. The resolution requires long-term efforts through a gradual and persistent approach. Given the current situation, the international community should cherish the hard-earned progress and give full understanding to the great difficulties faced by countries concerned and continue to provide constructive assistance instead of simply putting pressure on them. The Rakhine issue should be properly addressed by Myanmar and Bangladesh through bilateral channels. The two countries should continue to solve issues that emerge from the implementation of the repatriation agreement through dialogue. The priority is to start the repatriation process as soon as possible as a first step forward. There should not be any precondition. Issues such as freedom of movement and citizenship should be solved gradually during the repatriation process. The UNHCR and UNDP should improve their coordination with the Myanmar government, overcome technical difficulties, avoid politicization, and implement in earnest the tripartite MOU. The international community should focus more attention on provide more help to poverty eradication efforts at the local level to realize sustainable development, improve livelihood and economic and social conditions, and seek stability and harmonious coexistence of all ethnic groups. This is a fundamental way to solve the issues in the long term. China commends UNDP and the World Bank in their active work to help realize local development. We hope the international community continues to make contributions to the development of Myanmar and Bangladesh. Security Council members should continue to maintain its unity. UN entities should play their respective roles and improve coordination with Myanmar, Bangladesh, and other countries in the region. The international community should continue to be patient and promote dialogues between Myanmar and Bangladesh, facilitate the resolution of issues of practical significance, and realize the long-term peace and stability in the Rakhine State. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States, Mr. Haley.
Thank you, Mr. President, and welcome back to New York. We also want to thank Mr. Secretary-General, Under-Secretary General Gettu, and Ms. Blanchett. I will just tell you, thank you for using the power of your voice in a time where the Rohingya have too few voices to fight for them, so we appreciate you being here. 1 year ago this week, unspeakable violence was reaching its peak in Burma. A brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing was underway, one that ultimately resulted in over 700,000 Rohingya refugees exiled in camps in Bangladesh. Now, thanks to the support of the U.S. Department of State, we have an official accounting of what these refugees witnessed. and what they suffered before they were driven from their homes. The results are consistent with the recently released UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Burma. The world can no longer avoid the difficult truth of what happened in Burma. Let me warn everyone who is listening, the details of the crimes the Rohingya suffered in Burma are stomach-churning. They are difficult to hear, and even more difficult to say. But the facts of the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya must be said, and they must be heard. The State Department report is eye-opening, even for those of us who think we have a good understanding of what has occurred in Burma over the past 2 years. It is based on interviews with 1,024 Rohingya refugees in camps throughout Cox's Bazar's refugee camp. The interviews were conducted by a team of experienced international human rights investigators. The refugees interviewed were randomly selected. In short, the methodology of this report is sound, and its conclusions are shocking. The first-hand accounts of the survivors reveal that a majority of the Rohingya directly experienced violence, either to their homes, to their families, or to both. Most importantly, the report identifies one group as the perpetrator of the overwhelming majority of these crimes: the Burmese military and security forces. The numbers tell just part of the story. 82% of the refugees saw a killing. 82% saw their homes or their villages destroyed. 65% witnessed an abduction, arrest, or detention of a fellow Rohingya. 64% watched a family member or a fellow villager injured. And half of the Rohingya refugees, 51%, said they witnessed sexual violence. 51%. 45% specifically witnessed a rape. And behind the numbers, there are stories of almost unbelievable brutality. In some areas, perpetrators used tactics that resulted in mass casualties. For example, locking people in houses to burn them, fencing off entire villages before shooting into the crowd, or sinking boats full of hundreds of fleeing Rohingya. Rohingya men, women, and children were mutilated, dismembered, decapitated, and burned alive. Infants and children were not spared. Multiple witnesses saw soldiers throwing infants and small children into fires and burning huts, into rivers, and into village wells. The very young, the very old, and the sick who couldn't escape the attacks were burned inside their huts. The military and police went from house to house looking for girls and women. When they found them, they didn't bother to hide what they were after. Women and girls were raped in the open, in public. Fully 1/5 of all Rohingya survived witnessed more than 100 victims being killed or injured. Let me say that again. 20% of the randomly selected survivors of the violence saw a mass casualty event. The United States, the United Kingdom, Kuwait, the Netherlands, Peru, and others have worked to keep the Security Council's focus on the atrocities in Burma. We have worked to hold the Burmese security forces accountable. Many of us have heard the accounts of victims firsthand. We've seen the sprawling refugee camps, and we've seen the bulldozed areas where villages once stood. We've seen where innocent human beings were raped, murdered, and burned alive for no other reason than their religious and ethnic identity. Some have stood up to help ease the suffering and provide accountability to Burma. The United States recognizes the generosity of the government and the people of Bangladesh. They have fed and sheltered nearly 1 million desperate people. Their generosity has saved countless lives. The United States is the largest provider of humanitarian assistance to the Rohingya crisis, and we recognize the others who have given generously as well. Beyond our humanitarian efforts are important efforts to demand accountability. In June, the EU and Canada sanctioned 7 Burmese military officers for their roles in the violence. Earlier this month, the U.S. Department of the Treasury sanctioned 5 Burmese military and border guard commanders and 2 units of the Burmese Army for their involvement in the ethnic cleansing and other human rights abuses. But much more has to be done. The UN must have full and unimpeded access to Burma to deliver humanitarian aid and development assistance. The media must have access to the country, including Rakhine State. A free and responsible press is critical for any democracy. We expect to see Wallon and Ja So-u, 2 Reuters journalists facing trial for reporting the violence against the Rohingya, acquitted of all charges when a Burmese court renders their verdict next week. The difficult path toward democracy must continue in Burma and culminate in a military that is subordinate to the civilian government, not the other way around. Here in the Security Council, we must hold those responsible for violence to account. A responsive democratic government that respects the rights of its minorities will not emerge in Burma until the government demonstrates that it is committed to accountability. We still suffer the shame that our predecessors did after Rwanda, after Srebrenica, if we do not act when the Burmese government falls short. In one of his final acts of service, Kofi Annan led a commission that investigated the causes of the crisis in Burma. The commission recommended equal rights for all Burmese citizens. It called for all Burmese to have opportunity to feed their families. It called for all the people of Burma to enjoy freedom of movement and have equal access of justice under the law. The implementation of these recommendations would advance the dignity and security of all Burmese people. Until then, none of us, not the members of the Security Council, not the Burmese military and civilian leaders, not other world leaders, none of us has the excuse of ignorance. We are now all armed with the devastating eyewitness accounts of the Rohingya, which lead us to the following conclusions. Children, babies, women, and men suffered unspeakable crimes. The attacks were planned, premeditated, and coordinated. The perpetrator was the Burmese military and security forces. The whole world is watching what we will do next, and if we will act. Thank you.
I thank Ambassador Healy of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you also for organizing this very important meeting today. Let me start by thanking you, Mr. Secretary-General, and Goodwill Ambassador of the UNHCR, Ms. Blanchett, and Associate Administrator of UNDP, Mr. Gettu, for your strong briefings. This week marks 1 year since the report of the Annan Commission. Last week, we mourned the passing of Mr. Kofi Annan in this council, and we remembered his legacy. Today, we should honor his legacy by encouraging Myanmar to implement all the recommendations of the Annan Commission in full. There is no greater tribute than implementation of the pathway which Mr. Kofi Annan, who cared deeply for Myanmar, provided to us for an inclusive future in Rakhine State. It provided hope for a solution of the complex challenges of Rakhine State. Hope that was destroyed by the terrorist attack by ARSA and the violent response of the Myanmar security forces. They were meant to protect the Rohingya. Instead, they violently chased away more than 700,000 women, men, and children from their homes to neighboring Bangladesh, where the government and the people have opened their homes and their land for those in need. 1 year later, virtually none of the Rohingya refugees felt safe to return. This has become one of the largest humanitarian crises of the 21st century. And it is in this sobering reality that we meet today. Today I will reflect on, firstly, the urgent need for accountability, secondly, the return of the Rohingya people to Myanmar, and thirdly, this Council's further engagement. Mr. President, on accountability. In Kutupalong camp last April, the Council saw the devastating effects of this crisis. And I will never forget the large number of persons that were physically and psychologically wounded. Small children with deep scars on their heads and on their limbs. They did not play. They did not dream. We met a woman holding a 16-day-old baby. She did not know how to bond with the child. She did not know who the father was. She was raped by Myanmar soldiers the night that her husband was murdered. And this was not an isolated incident. Sexual violence perpetrated against Rohingya women and girls was used to instill fear in the Rohingya to force them to flee. The effects of these horrendous crimes will last for generations. And justice is not only a means to ensure that Rohingya feel safe enough to voluntarily return to their homes in Rakhine State. Ensuring accountability is an end in and of itself. The report of the independent fact-finding mission of the Human Rights Council highlights the need for prosecutions for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide, and to hold those responsible to account. The shocking findings of the fact-finding mission's report need follow-up and should be included in legal procedures to establish accountability. The Myanmar authorities announced the formation of a commission of inquiry. While we are encouraged that Myanmar takes a step towards justice, intentions are only meaningful when followed by concrete steps towards full accountability. And it is up to the Myanmar government to show it meets the standard. If there's no progress at the national level, the international community has to take responsibility and provide alternatives. And then this Council needs to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court. There can be no impunity. Mr. President, my second point is about the safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of the Rohingya people to Rakhine State. The MOU between Myanmar and UNHCR and UNDP was a first step in the right direction, but we have serious concerns about its implementation. If Myanmar is serious about its willingness to let refugees return safely, the best way to show that is by allowing the UN unfettered access to northern Rakhine to assist and to fulfill its mandate. By addressing the issue of severely restricted freedom of movement for the Rohingya people in Rakhine State, by making sure that IDPs can return to their places of origin, and by offering a credible path to citizenship for those who are entitled to it by law. Thirdly, this Council's engagement. It was in response to a letter from the Secretary-General that this Council decided to give this human tragedy the attention it deserves. And we thank you, Mr. Secretary-General, for your leadership and commitment to the Rohingya people from day one. This Council has constructively engaged with the Myanmar authorities both during and following its visit. We, however, have to conclude this approach has yielded minimal results. I hear a call for patience, but time is pressing. The international community cannot rely on the generous hospitality of Bangladesh forever. And new realities are created on the ground that make it more difficult for people to return to their homes or their places of origin. Traces, essential for truth-finding and accountability, are erased. The role of the press is crucial in this regard, as free press serves the governed instead of the government. We therefore call for the immediate release of the two Reuters journalists. The Myanmar government needs to pick up the pace. It needs to create an environment conducive to return, sustainable peace, and should also ensure accountability. We expect results. The Security Council will have to continue its engagement, working side by side with other UN efforts, including those of the Special Envoy, the Human Rights Council and its fact-finding mission, and the funds and programs to move the situations toward progress. We all, and Myanmar above all, need to work without delay, using all tools at our disposal to achieve the same objective. A democratic Myanmar in which all ethnic, minority, and religious groups, including Rohingya, can live together peacefully throughout the territory. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Netherlands for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Peru.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we welcome the convening of this meeting and the relevant briefings by Secretary-General António Guterres, Ms. Cate Blanchett as the Goodwill Ambassador representing the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, and Mr. Tegegnework Gettu of the UNDP. Peru follows closely and with considerable concern the situation of the Muslim Rohingya people in the Rakhine State in Myanmar, as well as the situation of these people in the largest refugee camp in the world, established in Cox's Bazar, thanks to the solidarity of the government and people of Bangladesh, which now shelters more than 1 million people. 1 year has passed since the peak of violence triggered the massive exodus of hundreds of thousands of people, and 4 months have gone by since we, the members of the Security Council, have been able to confirm on site the seriousness of the humanitarian situation, the vulnerability of the population, the horror of reported atrocities. Peru had the honor to head the visit of members of the Council along with the UK and Kuwait. However, we must recognize that response since then has still fallen short of resolving this crisis in any sustainable way, in getting to the root causes and in guaranteeing due accountability. That is, despite efforts of the international community and at the initiative of the Secretary-General, who brought this matter to the Council, exercising for the first time since 1986 the prerogatives entrusted to the Council in the UN Charter. We must redouble our efforts to ensure the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of the Muslim Rohingya people, recognizing the responsibility of the Burmese authorities and the international community to protect the population. We recognize that this is a complex situation and it presents major challenges as part of a delicate process of peace, reconciliation, and democratization. The agreement signed by Myanmar with Bangladesh, the UNHCR, UNDP, and the establishment of an office for the Special Envoy in Naypyidaw are steps in the right direction, as is the establishment of the Independent Commission of Inquiry. These arrangements must lead to results on the ground in terms of access to justice for returnees. We welcome recent meetings that have been held to provide means of subsistence and the provision of basic services for returnees. However, we emphasize the urgent need to implement as a whole the recommendations of the Kofi Annan Commission. We would also take this opportunity to join in the tribute paid to the former Secretary-General and to highlight the power of his legacy. We underscore the need to tackle the root causes of the conflict in Rakhine State and at the same time the marginalization of Muslim Rohingya. This means recognizing them as citizens, ensuring the full exercise of their rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of movement, countering the dehumanizing narrative, and reversing discriminatory legislation. We must reverse mistrust of the Rohingya population. We must promote dialogue among all actors involved, including the affected population and neighboring countries, with the support and assistance of the UN and of this Council. We must set up mechanisms on the ground to coordinate and guarantee short and long-term conditions required for the return of refugees and the establishment of sustainable peace. We welcome the meeting of ministers and the ministers of Myanmar and Bangladesh on the 10th of August, and we underscore the urgency to allow for full access for humanitarian assistance. Finally, we believe it is essential to have a process of accountability which is transparent, independent, and comprehensive, with jurisdiction over all human rights violations. Peru is considering the recent report of the Human Rights Council fact-finding mission, including its specific recommendations. We emphasize that these atrocities must not go unpunished. In the immediate future, we must allow access to the north of Rakhine for the UNHCR and for independent international actors in order to ensure that these forgotten victims, as the Secretary-General has called them, receive full justice. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Peru for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, Minister, Côte d'Ivoire would wish to congratulate you on the excellent stewardship of the work of this Council and to thank the UK delegation for organising this important debate on the situation in Myanmar. My delegation also thanks the Secretary-General, Mr. António Guterres, for his very detailed presentation on the situation of the Rohingya populations in Myanmar and Bangladesh. We also convey our thanks to Mr. Tegegnework Gettu, the USG of the United Nations, and the representative of UNDP, as well as to Ms. Cate Blanchett, the UN Goodwill Ambassador for the UNHCR, for their briefings. Mr. President, the crisis began a year ago on the 25th of August 2017. It brought with it the massive displacement of populations, majority of them were women and children, and following this, the situation in Myanmar, and in particular the issue of displaced and refugees from the Rohingya population, as well as human rights in Rakhine State, continues to draw the attention of the international community. Indeed, some progress has been made since the mission made by a delegation of the Council to Myanmar and Bangladesh from the 28th of April to the 1st of May 2018, but nonetheless enormous challenges remain to allowing for Rohingya refugees to return to their homes, and the complexity of the humanitarian situation and the human rights situation remains. Côte d'Ivoire remains convinced that there is a need to work collectively to find a sustainable and viable solution to this crisis, and to end the tragedy lived through on a daily basis by the Rohingya populations in Bangladesh and in Myanmar. Furthermore, we must underscore that no long-term solution to this crisis will be possible without the full and entire involvement of Myanmar. For this reason, my delegation hails the commitment of the government of Myanmar to collaborate with the United Nations on the basis of a Memorandum of Understanding signed between three parties on the 6th of June 2018, including the UNHCR and the UNDP, and within close cooperation with Ms. Christine Schreiner-Burgener, the Secretary-General Special Envoy for Myanmar. In this regard, my country encourages the authorities in Myanmar to work further to re-establish trust. Trust is a determining factor for an effective return of the population, and that would be a return that is voluntary, dignified, safe and sustainable to their homes or to wherever they choose, pursuant to the presidential statement of the Security Council on the 6th of November 2017. Furthermore, to make this commitment manifest, it would seem timely for the government of Myanmar to look at the means of facilitating broader access to UN agencies and to their partners, in particular in Rakhine State, so that they are able to provide adequate humanitarian assistance for the populations in need. Mr. President, Côte d'Ivoire remains convinced that open and sustained cooperation between Bangladesh and Myanmar will contribute effectively to solving the crisis. In this regard, it hails the signing on the 10th of August of an agreement between both countries, in particular on the repatriation of refugees and the establishment of a telephone link between their respective foreign ministers. My delegation has high hopes that this new agreement will follow on from the bilateral agreement of the 23rd of November 2017, allowing for the effective, voluntary, safe and dignified repatriation of Rohingya refugees. My country also believes that the long-term settlement of this crisis will come through proper management of its deep-rooted causes. In this respect, we encourage Myanmar to take courageous measures to find solutions to deep-rooted problems. President, the issue of return of refugees and displaced persons also poses the problem of social cohesion, which must be restored between the different communities living in Myanmar, mainly in Rakhine State. The role of civil society here may be decisive. This is why my delegation hails the involvement of religious leaders in this issue and supports their actions to promote peace and reconciliation between the communities of their countries. Furthermore, my delegation is of the view that specific action should be taken to ensure, on the basis of inclusive economic and social development in Rakhine State, a decent and sustainable future for refugees and displaced persons, which would promote voluntary return. This is what is behind the recommendations of the Advisory Committee on Rakhine State, led by the former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan, to whom we pay our respects. This commission stipulates solutions for the economic development of the state, with a view to assuring peace and security throughout it and improving the living conditions of all components within its population. Mr. President, it is undeniable that the fight against impunity represents a cornerstone in managing this crisis. Indeed, as was rightly mentioned by the Secretary-General during his visit to refugee camps in Bangladesh on the 2nd of July 2018, Rohingya refugees are demanding justice in the face of a situation that is probably, and I quote, one of the most tragic stories of systematic violation of human rights ever recorded, end of quote. Information in the report of the International Independent Fact-Finding Mission from within the UN on the incidents in Myanmar, which appeared on the 27th of August, highlighted blatant human rights violations carried out by the army and other security forces, and these are also a source of grave concern for our Council. My delegation, therefore, encourages the government of Myanmar to take diligent measures so that the perpetrators of these human rights violations, in particular those perpetrated against women and children, are brought to account. With this in mind, the creation of an independent commission of inquiry to establish who is responsible for these alleged human rights violations should allow us to achieve accountability. Mr. President, in closing, I must highlight the importance of a regional approach to solving this crisis. This remains a necessity for upholding peace and security in this part of the world. With this in mind, my delegation hails the leadership of the Chinese government and pays tribute to the government and to the people of Bangladesh for their great generosity. It also calls on the donor community and on all relevant stakeholders to provide particular support to this country, as has the World Bank. In its letter of the 20th of July, the country has asked the Security Council to address the issues that might arise in security terms if there is a prolonged presence of refugees on its territory. Finally, Côte d'Ivoire would like to reiterate its call on the international community to commit resolutely to solving the situation in Myanmar in its quest for peace and stability in its reconstruction efforts as well. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Côte d'Ivoire for his statement. I now invite and give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Secretary-General and Mr. Tegegnework Gettu for the detailed briefings and remarks. I also welcome to the Council and thank Ms. Cate Blanchett, UNHCR Good Ambassador, for her valuable remarks. It has been a year since the most recent outbreak of violence in Rakhine State in Myanmar that forced more than 700,000 Rohingya to flee to Bangladesh. We remain deeply worried about the humanitarian situation, especially in Rakhine State, where hundreds of thousands of people are waiting for our assistance. Every day, lost to bureaucratic deliberations means that we are collectively responsible for human lives that are perishing. As we welcome the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between Myanmar, UNDP and UNHCR on assisting in the repatriation and resettlement process, we also urge its full implementation and hope that Myanmarese authorities will fully cooperate with the UN agencies. We acknowledge the information about granting access by the Myanmarese authorities to the 23 villages and hope that UNHCR teams will have unlimited and independent access to these pilot project sites. We continuously urge the government of Myanmar to step up its efforts to create sustainable conditions conducive to the safe, voluntary and dignified return of Rohingya refugees and internally displaced persons to their homes. We believe that significant steps from the decision makers in Naypyidaw are needed as the progress on the ground is not sufficient. Therefore, we are pleased to hear that further contacts between the relevant ministries of Bangladesh and Myanmar are being established to discuss the implementation of the bilateral agreement signed in November last year. We are deeply concerned with the UN Human Rights Council fact-finding mission's report, which was published yesterday. particularly regarding the violations which may amount to the crimes under international law. In that context, let me underline that in order to stop recurrence of violence, the issue of impunity and accountability for those crimes needs to be addressed. We call upon the government in Naidibab to cooperate with the fact-finding mission, including by granting access to the country. We further acknowledge the formation of the Independent Commission of Inquiry by Myanmar's authorities and hope that it will commence a transparent and unbiased investigation of all cases of human rights violations. I believe there wouldn't be a better way to commemorate Mr. Kofi Annan than to fully concentrate on the implementation of the recommendations of the Rakhine Advisory Commission, which he chaired in order to address the root causes of the crisis. Before I conclude, I would like to underline that we are not forgetting that Myanmar is a developing country with a fragile economy and prone to natural disasters. Comprehensive approach focus on building resilience of the society and supporting the state's internal capabilities needs to be further developed. We are aware that rebuilding Rakhine and healing the local community will be a long process. The international community, after delivering immediate humanitarian aid, should focus on developing a long-term strategy to assist Myanmar in rebuilding and developing the Rakhine state and other parts of the country that will require international assistance. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Poland for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Mr. President, I would like to thank Secretary-General for the update on the latest developments in Myanmar and the plight of Rohingya refugees who fled from the Rakhine state to Bangladesh exactly 1 year ago. We're grateful to Cate Blanchett, UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador, for her emotional statement and hope that her coming on board will pave the way for progress towards reconciliation and sustainable peace. We also thank UNDP Associate Administrator Gettu for the valuable contribution to the discussion today. As fate would have it, it's just 1 year ago that Rakhine Advisory Commission, led by former UN Secretary-General Dr. Kofi Annan, submitted its recommendations. We pay tribute to Dr. Annan and express our sincere hope that the government of Myanmar will implement all 88 recommendations of the Commission to bring lasting peace, security, and prosperity to Myanmar, including Rakhine State. Exactly a year ago, the international community has witnessed one of the largest humanitarian atrocity and human rights catastrophe with displacement of more than 700,000 Rohingya refugees who have fled into Bangladesh since the 25th of August 2017 attack against Myanmar security forces that sparked the current crisis. The fact-finding mission report gives the full account of the status quo. What is most striking is that 60% of the Rohingya refugees are children who are forced to leave their homes and, as the Security Council members have seen themselves in April in Cox's Bazar, have to stay in an extremely difficult condition in refugee camps. Kazakhstan commends the efforts of the United Nations and all humanitarian partners for helping the Rohingya refugees by providing food, shelter, healthcare, and water, among other means of support. We note some positive measures taken by the government of Myanmar. We are particularly encouraged by the recent ministerial meeting in Naypyidaw between Myanmar and Bangladesh, the agreement on the speedy repatriation of displaced refugees from the Cox's Bazar back to Rakhine, as well as establishment of a hotline at the ministerial level, which bode well for some constructive outcomes. Kazakhstan welcomes the MOU signed between the government of Myanmar and UNHCR and UNDP in June 2018. We hope that UN funds and programs will henceforth have unfettered and safe access to all the areas of Rakhine in order to render emergency assistance. This is the much-awaited access needed to alleviate the present human suffering. The recently established Independent Commission of Inquiry could be considered as one of the key steps towards reconciliation and transitional justice. At the same time, my delegation firmly believes that including a reputable representative of Muslim community in the above-mentioned commission would have greatly increased the credibility of this commission and help to build bridges. Kazakhstan welcomes the opening of the office of the Special Envoy of the Secretary-General of Myanmar, Ms. Kristen Schreiner-Bergener, in Naypyidaw. We are confident that positive engagement of the Myanmar authorities with the Special Envoy will further strengthen the cooperation of the government of Myanmar with the UN. At the same time, there cannot be any durable and lasting solution for the Rohingya issue without addressing the root causes of the crisis. Key among them are those related to the citizenship and restoration of the rights and freedom of the Rohingyas, poverty alleviation, and development. We still observe severe restrictions on freedom of movement, as well as restricted access to education, healthcare, and sources of livelihoods for those who continue staying in Rakhine State, even today as we speak. It is obvious that only when Rohingya refugees enjoy security, see tangible progress in the above-mentioned areas, and witness justice served with regards to those who suffered from the outrageous acts of violence, will they start returning to the country. Although we completely understand that intercommunal trust cannot be restored overnight, and that it will be a long-running and a challenging process, UN agencies could be of help if provided the necessary access and conditions for work. Such negotiations, to be successful, demand the active participation of all stakeholders. The delegation of Kazakhstan, therefore, urges the government of Myanmar to address all the related issues in depth and make every effort to eliminate the root causes with the help of the international community. Given the complexity and long-lasting effects of the humanitarian crisis in Rakhine State, we appeal to all member states, international organizations, and other actors to continue providing their support and assistance to Bangladesh and Myanmar to overcome the crisis. We should work patiently and diligently with both sides, as well as other stakeholders, to achieve a tangible result. The Security Council should not only continue to be seized with the situation of the Rohingyas, but to see it is resolved satisfactorily. My delegation is committed to support all aspects of multilateral action to find a sustainable solution to the plight of the Rohingya refugees. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the UK for organizing this meeting, and we are pleased to see you presiding over this meeting. I would also like to thank Secretary-General António Guterres for being here with us this afternoon and for his briefing on the security and humanitarian situation in Myanmar. We also like to appreciate UNDP Associate Administrator Tegegnework Gettu and UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador Cate Blanchett for their useful briefings. It is evident that there are efforts that have been undertaken by the government of Myanmar in trying to address the situation in Rakhine State following the visit by this council and the follow-up engagements. Certainly, more needs to be done in areas of humanitarian situation, accountability measures on alleged human rights violations, and implementation of the recommendation of the Rakhine Advisory Commission, and in many other areas to bring lasting peace and reconciliation in Myanmar. The Memorandum of Understanding signed between the government of Myanmar and the United Nations agencies, UNHCR and UNDP, on 6 June 2018 is a step in the right direction, which we hope will facilitate conditions for the safe, voluntary, sustainable, and dignified repatriation of refugees. It is indeed vital to ensure the swift and full implementation of this agreement. The Council visit to Myanmar and Bangladesh last May provided the opportunity to witness the condition of the refugee camps, which continues to be a matter of serious concern. Therefore, We underline the need to address the worsening humanitarian situation and the suffering of those who have fled, particularly women and children. Despite the devastating humanitarian situation, the efforts undertaken by the government of Bangladesh to provide safety and humanitarian assistance to refugees is highly commendable. However, the magnitude and the scale of devastation needs further financial and logistical support to Bangladesh, the United Nations, and other humanitarian partners who are engaged in this effort. Of course, the complex challenges the Rakhine State is facing needs political solution, which requires a comprehensive strategy aimed at addressing the root causes of this crisis through reconciliation, peace, and stability and development. In this vein, the rapid and effective implementation of the recommendation of the Advisory Commission remains absolutely vital. We underscore the need for transparent and independent investigation mechanism to ensure accountability for the alleged human rights violations. Along this line, we note the initiative undertaken by the government of Myanmar to establish an independent commission of inquiry, which also comprises international personalities. In this regard, we stress the need to expedite the process in order to ensure reconciliation, peace, and stability in the Rakhine State. The bilateral engagement between Bangladesh and Myanmar remains very important to ensure safe, voluntary, and dignified return of refugees. It is in this context that we took positive note of the recent Myanmar-Bangladesh ministerial meeting held on 10th August 2018. We encourage both governments to expedite the implementation of the agreed Memorandum of Understanding. It is also important that this Council continues to maintain its unity and enhance its cooperation with the governments of Myanmar and Bangladesh, as well as regional and sub-regional organizations in addressing the situation. We support and encourage the Special Envoy's engagement with the government of Myanmar and other relevant stakeholders, which aims at building confidence and mutual trust to pave the way for greater cooperation in resolving the situation in the Rakhine State. I thank you.
Representative of Kuwait.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this important session, and we welcome you as President of the meeting. We express our appreciation for the presence of His Excellency, the Secretary-General, Mr. António Guterres, and for his valuable briefing to the Council. Your presence with us today is a clear indication of what this humanitarian issue means to you, to the members of the Security Council, and to the international community as a whole. We highly value your tremendous efforts on behalf of the Muslim minority of the Rohingya refugees and emphasize our full support for your lofty endeavors. I would also like to thank Mr. Gettu of the UNDP and Ms. Cate Blanchett, the UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador, for their valuable briefings. The current month of August marks 1 year since the start of violence in the Rakhine State in Myanmar. This violence has led to the displacement of more than 887,000 people of the Rohingya minority to Bangladesh, according to statistics by UNHCR, bringing the total number of Rohingya refugees in the biggest refugee camps in the world to 1.1 million. Today's session comes 1 day after the issuance of the report of the fact-finding mission, which documented crimes that amount to genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Myanmar. The report confirmed the conclusions reached by many international organizations on these crimes, and is consistent with what we have witnessed during the Security Council visits to Rakhine and what we have heard from eyewitnesses of these crimes during our meetings with the Rohingya refugees in the camps of Cox's Bazar. The world is following the proceedings of our session today at the Security Council and expects nothing less from us than to persist in our moral and humanitarian position and to rise above any political considerations in dealing with one of the worst catastrophes in our modern history, a catastrophe that is still being lived by the Rohingya minority, which was subjected to killings and torture, resulting from their oppression and forced displacement. This can only be described as ethnic cleansing, aimed at erasing their culture and wiping their identity. Since the Security Council visit to Bangladesh and Myanmar last April, we have taken note of some of the initial steps taken by the government of Myanmar towards resolving this humanitarian crisis. Meetings between officials in both Bangladesh and Myanmar, the signing of memoranda of understanding, and the establishment of a body to investigate violations of human rights are all good steps, albeit limited steps. And the majority of these steps have not been implemented on the ground. The demands identified by the Security Council in its presidential statement and the recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, led by Kofi Annan, are clear and concrete demands, aiming at resolving the root causes of the crisis, ending the suffering of the refugees, and ensuring their voluntary return in peaceful and dignified manner to their original homes in Myanmar. Such voluntary return cannot begin without taking a series of measures based on confidence building, in order to ensure a safe return and a dignified life in Rakhine State. Here I would like to recall some of these measures which should be taken prior to the voluntary return of refugees. These include: an independent and transparent investigation must take place into the crimes and other transgressions committed against the Rohingya minority in Rakhine State. The government of Myanmar must take all measures to guarantee the immediate cessation of violence and ethnic discrimination, and to ban the excessive use of force in violation of the right of citizens in Rakhine State. The closure of all camps known as IDP camps. The government of Myanmar must continue to take the necessary measures against incitement of violence and hatred in order to ensure peace and harmony amongst all communities under the rule of law. Granting permission for all UN agencies and other partners to freely enter Rakhine State and ensuring their freedom of movement safely and without impediments. The elimination of all root causes for the crisis of the Rohingya minority without discrimination and regardless of ethnicity or religion, while granting them their inherent right to citizenship. This is a matter which has been stressed by the General Assembly in its resolution last year. The start of comprehensive social and economic reforms while eliminating the root causes of the crisis of the Rohingya refugees. Mr. President, the humanitarian tragedy of the Rohingya refugees compels the international community to double its efforts to alleviate their daily suffering. As we hold our meeting today, the refugee camps are facing the challenges of the monsoon rains and floods, which led to the collapse of some sites due to hurricanes and mudslides. In closing, Mr. President, the first article of Chapter 1 of the UN Charter stresses in its third paragraph the importance of achieving international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all, without discrimination as to race, sex, language, or religion, and without discrimination between men and women. This is the charter which we, the peoples of the world, have pledged to observe, with a view to saving future generations from the scourge of war. This is the charter that determines the course of our future generations. This is the charter that enjoins us to face all issues threatening international peace and security in unity. This is the charter which compels us to rise above our political differences for the sake of protecting the vulnerable, seeking final resolution for their predicament. Among those are refugees with whom we met in Cox's Bazar in Rakhine, listening to their concerns and suffering, as they beseeched us not to forget their demands after we left their camps. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Kuwait for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, my delegation would like to thank the UN Secretary-General, Mr. António Guterres, for his clear and detailed briefing. We also wish to thank Mr. Tegegnework Gettu, Associate Administrator of the UNDP, and Ms. Cate Blanchett, Goodwill Ambassador of the UNHCR, for their very valuable and interesting briefings. Since the massive exodus which took place last August, in which more than 700,000 Rohingya were forced to flee Myanmar towards Bangladesh, my delegation has paid particular attention to the situation of the refugees from that ethnic minority who for a year now have remained in community centers in Bangladesh in conditions of vulnerability. We would warmly praise the efforts of the government of Bangladesh and of its people, with the assistance of the United Nations, its partners, and other non-governmental organizations, in providing security, shelter, and humanitarian assistance to all these people who have fled violence. We encourage them to continue with these efforts until these people can return voluntarily in conditions of security and dignity to their homes in Myanmar. Madam President, in efforts to tackle the crisis, a working delegation of Council members visited Bangladesh and Myanmar between April and May of this year. We visited specific sites, and we had an opportunity to speak with governmental and military authorities and officials from all levels. Subsequently, the Special Envoy, Ms. Bergener, visited the area in June and July, where she visited Rakhine and held meetings with Myanmar authorities. In addition to these visits, I would highlight, inter alia, the visit of the delegation headed by Secretary-General António Guterres at the beginning of July. He traveled to Cox's Bazar and he met with the Prime Minister of Bangladesh. Equatorial Guinea is grateful for the reception and the assistance which the authorities of both these countries and UN agencies provided to all of these delegations in order to facilitate their work. We also share common concerns about the situation of refugees in community centers, and we recognize problems which to date have prevented the massive voluntary and safe return supported by a political arrangement guaranteeing the rights of Rohingya in Myanmar. That being said, we would appeal to the government of Myanmar to redouble its efforts to create appropriate conditions to ensure safe, voluntary, and dignified return of Rohingya refugees and IDPs to their homes in Rakhine. My delegation does, however, welcome some clarifications provided in the letter dated 27 June from the permanent representative of Myanmar addressed to the President of the Council, namely, the establishment of the Union Enterprise for Humanitarian Assistance, Resettlement and Development in Rakhine in order to provide humanitarian assistance to all communities in need and to coordinate that assistance. Secondly, we recognize the signing of an MOU between the government of Myanmar and two UN bodies, namely the UNHCR and the UNDP, on the 6th of June 2018. That MOU led the way not just to providing assistance at various phases of return and resettlement in the repatriation process, but it also aimed to improve humanitarian assistance and subsistence opportunities for returnees, as well as for all of the communities in Rakhine State. The assertion of the government not to allow any human rights violations and to take measures against perpetrators in accordance with the law, if these allegations are backed by sufficient proof. The public commitment of the government of Myanmar to implement the recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, as well as the establishment of a high-level ministerial commission to implement those recommendations. And finally, given these assertions, I wish to conclude by encouraging Council members and the international community to continue to play a constructive role in creating necessary external conditions in order to facilitate consultation and dialogue, and in order to assist the government of Myanmar to find a solution to this situation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Equatorial Guinea for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
We would like to thank Secretary-General António Guterres for his report, and we take this opportunity to reiterate to him our full support in his important endeavors. We also welcome the report by the Associate Administrator of the UNDP, Mr. Tegegnework Gettu, and the Goodwill Ambassador of the UNHCR, Ms. Cate Blanchett. Madam President, 1 year after the violent events in the state of Rakhine, my delegation once again expresses condemnation and profound concern. The aftermath generated by these events have led to the displacement of some 900,000 people of Rohingya origin to Bangladesh. Without any doubt, these violent actions cannot go unpunished. My delegation therefore reiterates that these events must be duly investigated, and those responsible must be identified and brought to justice, and they must be held accountable for their actions in appropriate courts. Impunity is unacceptable, and it runs counter to the efforts and the primary objective of achieving reconciliation in the country and in Rakhine State. We recognize the establishment of the Independent Commission of Inquiry at the end of July in order to investigate all violations of human rights committed since August 2017. We also underscore the efforts of the government of Myanmar in the establishment of that commission, and in particular, the establishment of its work plan and the establishment of a specialized secretariat to assist the commission in its work. We call upon all bodies and institutions of the government of Myanmar to cooperate with the inquiry by the Commission, in particular in the compilation of data, information, and in eyewitness testimony. We hope that the work of the Commission will be conducted following principles of independence, impartiality, objectivity, transparency, integrity, and professionalism. Moreover, we must prevent similar events from being repeated in the future. The government of Myanmar must keep hate speech, segregation, and persecution from spreading. Quite the opposite, the government must promote dialogue, mediation, and negotiation in order to guarantee the physical security and safety of all of its inhabitants without any distinction with regard to race, ethnicity, or religion. It is also important for the government of Myanmar to look into the root causes of this crisis and to comply fully with the recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, which provides a clear roadmap for the peaceful solution to this sensitive situation, in particular with regard to the issue of citizenship, sustainable development of the Rohingya population, and the respect for the rights of these people. Similarly, the government must continue to work diligently and must show more tangible progress in efforts to ensure dignified, informed, and voluntary return of refugees and IDPs within the Rakhine State. With this understanding, we would underscore the establishment of a ministerial committee to this end and of the Advisory Council to follow up on the activities carried out by that committee. We welcome the coordination efforts and the technical work done by the government of Myanmar, the UN Office for Refugees, and the UNDP in implementing the Memorandum of Understanding, which was signed on the 6th of June this year. We also recognize that the work plan includes initiatives to promote sustainable socioeconomic development, improvements in health and education services, and the creation of conditions to promote peaceful coexistence among communities in the north of Rakhine State. We hope that the implementation of the MOU will be an effective tool for resolving the situation of refugees and IDPs. We welcome increased cooperation and coordination among humanitarian agencies and bodies in deploying and providing humanitarian assistance in Rakhine State. Particularly, we would underscore an increase in the activities of the ICRC, the UN FAO, the World Food Programme, and the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance. We highlight the readiness and openness shown by the government of Myanmar to work with the Secretary-General Special Envoy to find the best ways for tackling the problems and challenges facing this country. That being said, we underscore the agreement to open an office for the Special Envoy in the city of Naypyidaw. Madam President, we've noted with concern that according to the report of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees on the 19th of July, more than 11,000 people have continued to enter Bangladesh since the beginning of this year, escaping persecution and lack of security. This is a matter which must be dealt with urgently by the government of Myanmar. However, there are also urgent needs which must be addressed in Bangladesh. These include assistance to mothers who have given birth in refugee camps. There is also a need to improve the distribution of food and provision of humanitarian assistance so as to reduce the impact on the host communities, access to water and sanitation to avoid an outbreak of illnesses such as diphtheria. According to the World Health Organization, some 8,000 people are suffering from diphtheria. My delegation recognizes and commends the efforts of the government of Bangladesh over the past year with regard to refugees in that country. The international community and the United Nations must do everything possible to provide support to the host communities in Bangladesh, particularly in the short term, bearing in mind the fact that the rainy season and cyclones may have a devastating impact on the Rohingya people living in the Cox's Bazar camps. Finally, it is important to point out and to reiterate that Bangladesh is not responsible for the events in Myanmar. And in welcoming selflessly the Rohingya refugees, it requires the assistance from the entire international community, and it needs incentives in the short, medium, and long term. Since the unexpected arrival of more than 900,000 refugees is having a significant economic, political, and social impact in Bangladesh. The government and people of Bangladesh must receive full support from the United Nations, international financial organizations, and sub-regional and regional actors and mechanisms so that it can continue to cooperate and ensure until we can guarantee the safe return of refugees and IDPs. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Myanmar.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to congratulate you, first of all, for chairing this important meeting and for the successful UK presidency of the Security Council. Madam President, at the outset, please allow me to pay tribute to the late Dr. Kofi Annan, former Secretary-General of the United Nations, who had contributed tremendously toward our efforts to find lasting solutions to the problems that were jeopardizing peace and progress in Rakhine State. When he took on the responsibility to lead the Rakhine Advisory Commission at the request of the State Councillor Daw San Suu Kyi, he wanted Myanmar to succeed and reach its goals of peace, prosperity, security, and progress of the country. The Commission's recommendations are welcomed by all as important steps for lasting peace and development in Rakhine State. The people of Myanmar will always be grateful for his invaluable support and wise counsel in the country's democratic transition. We should all learn from his way of solving conflicts in a peaceful manner with a constructive and caring approach. Madam President, addressing to the deep-rooted and complex issue in Rakhine State, was the fundamental and crucial part of Myanmar government's efforts to building peace and national reconciliation in the country. In May 2016, within just 2 months of taking on the state responsibility, the government established the Central Committee for Implementation of Peace, Stability and Development in Rakhine State. Soon after, on 5th of September 2016, an advisory commission on Rakhine State, headed by Dr. Kofi Annan, was established. The commission was mandated to examine the complex challenges facing Rakhine State and to propose responses to those challenges. Barely a month later, on the 9th of October 2016, a religious extremist terrorist group called Akamul Mujahideen, later known as Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, ARSA, launched its first attack on 3 border police posts in northern Rakhine State. The attack was premeditated and well organized, causing death of 13 security personnel and other civilians. Their goal was clear: to incite violence and attract international attention of the issue at the time when the whole world was welcoming our peaceful democratic transition. On 24th of August 2017, the Rakhine Advisory Commission presents its final report to the government of Myanmar. The 88 recommendations aim at establishment of lasting peace and stability in Rakhine State. The challenges are daunting, multifaceted, and required multitasking. But we welcome the report and decided to carry on the task to implement the recommendations in good faith to the fullest extent within the shortest time frame possible and consonant with the situation of the ground. Then, Madam President, in the early hours of the 5th of August 2017, just a few hours after Mr. Kofi Annan handed his final report, ARSA launched premeditated, well-planned, and coordinated simultaneous armed attacks on 30 border guard posts and one army battalion headquarters in northern Rakhine. The attacks caused deaths of dozens of security personnel as well as many innocent civilians. ARSA has also brutally killed over 250 non-Muslim ethnic minorities in northern Rakhine since October 2016. On the same day that they attacked the security posts, on the 25th of August, ARSA massacred 100 Hindus, which was well documented. The ARSA attacks triggered predicted and logical response of Myanmar security forces to protect the life and property of every citizen, resulting in the subsequent mass displacement of people. These are plain facts, Madam President, and nothing but the truth. But these facts were conveniently discounted or ignored by mainstream media. The violence attacks were not coincidence. ARSA terrorists and their foreign masterminds knew too well that the Myanmar security forces would respond to the attacks with full force. They must also have anticipated the exodus of people from northern Rakhine to Bangladesh. These events were well planned and executed with the support of foreign terrorist organizations. The present grave humanitarian problems and the untold suffering of the innocent civilian people of all communities in Rakhine State were carefully calculated, instigated, and created by ARSA. Their objective was to undermine Myanmar government's commitment and efforts to find lasting solution through the speedy implementation of the Commission's recommendations and to elicit maximum international pressure on Myanmar to achieve their political goals. Mr. President, our gathering here today could have been a different one had there been no terrorist attack. It could have been a happier occasion to stock-taking, implementation of the Rakhine Advisory Commission, or an international pledging conference to help poverty alleviation. And so, sorry. and socio-economic development of all communities in Rakhine. The provocative terrorist attacks of October 2016 and August 2017 have affected the course of our earnest endeavor to build a peaceful, fair and prosperous future for the people of Rakhine. But nothing shall stop our determination to continue our effort to achieve our objective. Mr. President, we share deep sympathy and concern for all displaced persons, especially women and children. We believe that we will be able to solve the issue with our neighboring friends, Bangladesh, if we work together amicably in the spirit of good neighborliness. We have reached out to Bangladesh by sending ministerial delegations. We have invited Bangladesh Foreign Minister Mr. Mahmood Ali to Myanmar early this month. During his visit, the two sides agreed, among others, to deliver on a commitment made to speed up implementation of bilateral agreements on repatriation and to set up a hotline between the two countries at the ministerial level. Within 2 months between November 2017 and January 2018, we have signed 3 documents with Bangladesh to facilitate the repatriation of verified persons who crossed over to Bangladesh following the ARSA terrorist attacks in October 2016 and August 2017. According to the agreement on the physical arrangement for repatriation, the process of repatriation was scheduled to have commenced on 23rd of January this year. In line with these bilateral agreements, Myanmar made arrangements with Momentum for the repatriation of verified displaced persons. We have been ready to receive the first batch of verified returnees since 23rd of January. In February, Bangladesh has provided us with a list of 8,032 people without signature, fingerprints, and proper photograph, and more importantly, without the proper forms agreed by the two sides. Despite difficulties in verifying due to adequate information, we managed to verify 3952 as of 23rd August 2018. We are also ready to receive a list of over 1,200 verified Hindus and Muslims that we shared with Bangladesh. But we have yet to receive a single returnee despite our repeated requests for the repatriation. We call on Bangladesh to fulfill its obligation to accordance with the bilateral agreements to allow without delay the return of verified persons who consented to return to Rakhine voluntarily. Mr. President, another important issue is the systematic repatriation of displaced persons staying on the borderline. Since occupying the area 150 feet from the international borderline is unlawful, these people put themselves unwittingly in a situation that can affect stability of the two bordering countries. It is highly possible the area become an ARSA terrorist foothold. In this regard, we have requested Bangladesh authorities not to provide them any assistance from their side of the border. Instead, we are now arranging to provide humanitarian assistance for them from Myanmar side. Moreover, the government of Myanmar also signed an MOU with the UNDP and the UNHCR to assist speedy and efficient resettlement and rehabilitation of the returnees. We have already mapped out potential resettlement sites. On 7th of August, UN officials have been granted access to 23 villages in 13 village tracts, selected for the first phase of assessment program. An additional 3 village tracts have been marked out for the resettlement of IDPs residing near the borderline. We urge the UN team to start the assessment program as soon as possible. Mr. President, the government continues to implement the recommendations of the Rakhine Advisory Commission in earnest. 81 out of 88 recommendations have been implemented or under implementation. In the process of implementation, the government attaches great importance to the advice and opinion of the advisory board chaired by Dr. Surakiart Sathirathai, former Deputy Prime Minister of Thailand. The advisory board has submitted its final report on 16th of August. The report contained balanced and viable final recommendations, which will certainly receive our serious consideration. Mr. President, we recognize the crucial role of the United Nations in addressing the issue of Rakhine and the present humanitarian crisis in particular. We facilitated the visit of Security Council members and representatives of neighboring countries and the ASEAN chair in April this year. We welcomed appointment of Ambassador Christine Burgener as Special Envoy of the Secretary-General. We believe that we could maintain a constructive and fruitful relationship with the Special Envoy. We have facilitated her to open her office in Naypyidaw. Mr. President, let me now turn to the question of accountability. The government of Myanmar has made its position very clear that it will not condone any human rights abuse. Action will be taken against anyone if there is sufficient evidence. In this regard, the government has established an independent commission of inquiry led by Ambassador Rosario Manalo, an eminent diplomat with rich experience in the field of human rights. The commission also includes Ambassador Kenzo Oshima, another prominent diplomat, and 2 highly respected members of Myanmar. The commission is tasked to investigate the allegations of human rights violations and related issues following the 2 terrorist attacks. With a view to seeking accountability and reconciliation, and to formulate recommendations on steps to be taken to ensure peace and stability in Rakhine State. The Commission will submit its report to the President of Myanmar within a year, including its recommendations prepared on the basis of the outcome of its investigation. In discharging its mandate, the Commission will apply particularly the 1950 Investigation Committee Act, which gives the Commission necessary authority to investigate. The Commission will also avail itself of international human rights law and international humanitarian law where applicable. The government of Myanmar will provide protection to all those who are in contact with ICOE, the Commission, particularly victims and witnesses. The Commission will conduct its mandate in the principles of independence, impartiality, and objectivity. The members met for the first time on the 15th of this month and commences its work this week. With regard to the allegations of atrocity crimes committed by Myanmar security forces, as contained in the recent report of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar, I would like to reiterate that we did not accept the mandate of the mission because we have our concern about the mission's impartiality. Besides, I have serious doubt on the intention of the timing of the release of the report. The report, which was scheduled only to be submitted to the Human Rights Council on September 18, was hastily released on the eve of this particular meeting of the Security Council. This action raises serious questions about the objectivity, impartiality, and sincerity of fact-finding mission. Mr. President, the challenges we are facing today in Rakhine State is formidable. However, the government and people of Myanmar are united in our determination to achieve sustainable peace and development for all communities in Rakhine. We shall not let these challenges derail our ultimate goal of democratic nation building. It will take time and patience to build trust and confidence among communities. We shall seek reconciliation, but not retribution, compassion, but not hatred, integration, but not segregation. While the primary responsibility to address the situation in Rakhine rests with the government and people of Myanmar, objective, positive, and constructive contribution and support of the international community is crucial for the success of Myanmar's national efforts. This is not the time for exploiting the plight of the innocent people, particularly women and children, from Rakhine for self-interest and political grandstanding. This is the time to act, to show our genuine concern by taking practical steps. Let the first batch of verified people who have expressed their voluntary return to go back to their land. Let the first phase of assessment program commence where access has been granted. Let us not waste our time. Mr. President, in conclusion, I wish to express our sincere appreciation to all our friends who who are helping us in various ways to resolve the challenges in Rakhine at this critical juncture of democratic transition. We should make important policy decisions based on facts and full understanding of the issue at hand. We should view these complex issues from a broader perspective. We shall continue to work good faith with the United Nations and with all our friends near and far to end suffering of the people of Rakhine and rebuild their land so that all shall enjoy the fruit of peace and prosperity in the land blessed with so much resources and potentials. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Myanmar for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Bangladesh, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. We deeply appreciate the UK Presidency's initiative to organize this open briefing on the situation in Myanmar. The UK's consistent lead on this issue in the Council has been a source of moral strength for the millions of Rohingya and others affected by this humanitarian crisis. The eloquent testimonies we heard from the Secretary-General and the UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador, Madam Cate Blanchett, leave nothing much to be added. Every passing week, there is new information emerging about the extent of persecution and dehumanization the Rohingya had been subjected to, and about the possible ramifications of keeping the crisis unresolved for long. We take a moment to express our gratitude to each one of the world leaders, UN delegates and personnel, representatives of the media, civil society and academia, and conscientious global citizens for their unstinting solidarity, support and advocacy for what has turned out to be one of the largest displacement crises in our world today. Mr. President, 1 year of crying, now I am angry, quote unquote, read one of the banners carried by the Rohingya men, women and children who gathered at the camps in Cox's Bazar to mark the passage of one long, arduous year since they had been forcibly displaced from their homes across the border. Their grief and anger have many manifestations, and we have just heard some of their echoes in this Council chamber. The Human Rights Council's independent fact-finding mission released its report yesterday, and it is evident what caused such pervasive grief and anger among the forcibly displaced Rohingya. In no uncertain words, the FFM concluded that it was all caused in a premeditated and organized manner, and that the perpetrators had acted with a genocidal intent. These findings largely echoed those earlier shared by, among others, the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, the Special Advisors on Prevention of Genocide and Responsibility to Protect, and a host of other independent entities. With such conclusions at hand, the Security Council's custodianship of the issue remains all the more relevant and pressing. The Council had adopted a presidential statement, visited the affected people in Bangladesh and Myanmar, and continued to engage with a host of actors, including the Secretary-General's Special Envoy. Despite odds and obstacles, the Council has kept the issue alive and generally managed to speak in a unified voice in support of addressing the root cause of the crisis. As a directly affected party, Bangladesh recognizes the Council's efforts and calls for further calibrating its response in light of the prevailing circumstances on the ground and the emerging evidence into the atrocity crimes committed against the Rohingya. The 5-point agenda presented by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina at the UN General Assembly last year essentially captures our expectations of the UN and the international community and forms the basis of our engagements going forward. A high-powered national task force continues to remain functional for overall policy orientation and coordination. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, we had to invest our resources and energy into a massive humanitarian response, starting with immediate life-saving assistance. Thanks to the overwhelming support of our people and our many friends and partners from home and abroad, the humanitarian situation in the sprawling camps in Cox's Bazar has largely stabilized. It has been a relief for all concerned to have been able to avert the worst possible impact of the ongoing monsoon. There continues to be small-scale influx of people from the other side of the border, citing lack of access to food and security in the northern Rakhine state. It remains crucial for the forcibly displaced people and the much-stressed host communities to have the international community's enhanced and sustainable support for the UN response plan for the Rohingya humanitarian crisis. Pending their voluntary repatriation to Rakhine state, the Rohingya camped in Bangladesh need to have improved shelter, healthcare, livelihood and education options in the short to medium term. our authorities remain sensitized to some of the security and law and order issues in the camps and continue to work with the Rohingya themselves to strengthen community-based interventions and safeguards. We urge continued vigilance and cooperation by member states in the region to help mitigate potential security risks, including those posed by transnational actors. Mr. President, on the overriding priority of the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable repatriation of the Rohingya, we have concluded enabling agreements and arrangements with Myanmar and have already had a series of meetings of the joint working groups to identify and address some of the operational and technical challenges to implementing the agreed provisions. As far as Bangladesh is concerned, the initial steps towards repatriation have already been set in motion with the handing over of a short list of potential returnees to the Myanmar side in February this year. We are currently in the process of setting up transit infrastructures on our side as envisaged in the agreements and constituting a technical committee to oversee implementing and coordinating with the UNHCR and other relevant entities. It must be made clear, however, that the return of the Rohingya cannot be commenced unless the Rohingya themselves would regain the trust and confidence to voluntarily opt for repatriation. The Secretary-General and several delegations have already spoken at length about the prerequisites on the ground for creating an environment conducive to their repatriation. It is well documented that the Rohingya would, at the minimum, seek guarantee for their safety and security, return to their homes and property, freedom of movement and livelihood opportunities, and a clear pathway to their legitimate demand for citizenship in Myanmar. It would be entirely up to the Myanmar authorities to build trust among the Rohingya about their sustainable return and peaceful coexistence with other communities in the Rakhine state. During his visit to Myanmar earlier this month, our Honorable Foreign Minister noted Myanmar leadership's commitment across the board to facilitating the Rohingyas' return to the Rakhine state. He was briefed by some of the measures being contemplated for accommodation and livelihoods of the Rohingya and visited physical infrastructures built so far with the support of some friendly countries in the region. He invited Myanmar to send a delegation to Bangladesh to brief the Rohingya firsthand about the arrangements being made and to give them assurances about their safe and dignified return so that they feel encouraged to voluntarily put their signatures and fingerprints onto the agreed verification forms. Meanwhile, as the Secretary-General and others have mentioned, the Myanmar authorities can consider a number of demonstrable measures that can evoke confidence about an enabling situation on the ground. These include, first, allowing unimpeded access to UNDP and UNHCR to all the affected villages and townships in Rakhine State for necessary humanitarian and development work, as reportedly envisaged in the MOU concluded with Myanmar. Second, managing the safe and sustainable return of the Rohingya stranded along the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar, and pending their return, providing humanitarian assistance to them from the Myanmar side. Third, dismantling the IDP camps in Rakhine State in a way that allows the people confined therein to sustainably return to their homes or other places of choice with their rights and freedoms restored. And four, promoting reconciliation and trust among communities in Rakhine State and curbing the malicious spread of hate speech and incitement to violence. Most importantly, the question of accountability deserves to be addressed in the right earnest. The culture of impunity for the alleged crimes committed against the Rohingya must be brought to a closure to heal their trauma and restore a sense of justice. The Commission of Inquiry formed by Myanmar recently should be allowed to act independently and factor in the observations made by the FFM. The international community, including this Council, has certain specific options and responsibilities outlined in the FFM report and should give them due consideration. As a member state committed to the international criminal justice and as a state party to the Rome Statute and other relevant international instruments, Bangladesh should continue to cooperate with various international processes and initiatives on the accountability issue. At the same time, Bangladesh stands ready to cooperate with Myanmar on any of its security concerns and other issues of strategic interest in the spirit of good neighborliness. Mr. President, the last 1 year, the international community has not allowed its concerns over the Rohingya humanitarian issue to run its course and die down. The Security Council can help sustain the momentum by adopting a much-anticipated resolution that would allow the issue to be featured on its regular agenda. The General Assembly, at the initiative of the OIC, had adopted a resolution on the situation in Myanmar last year, which needs to be updated this year. not least in the interest of continuing the mandate of the Secretary-General's Special Envoy. We look forward to Member States' principled support to these initiatives. The outbreak of violence in the northern Rakhine state coincided with the release of the groundbreaking report of the Rakhine Advisory Commission headed by Dr. Kofi Annan. With Dr. Annan's sad demise, the Rohingya have indeed lost one of their key allies and guardians, a voice that articulated their aspirations and charted a way forward in addressing the root causes of a complex situation. We must do justice to Dr. Annan's memory and contributions by lending our continued support to Myanmar to ensure the full, unconditional, and non-selective implementation of all the recommendations he had presented to the Myanmar leadership. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bangladesh for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is therefore adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to